The more things change, the more they stay the same, right? Well, no. You see, your parents taught you that. Being good parents and all, they wanted you to grow up properly, so they taught you what they knew. And they were taught that phrase by their parents, who were correct at the time. You see, in your grandparents' era, the more things changed in a world that moved very slowly, change was hard to see happening. A bit like a frog in a pot. They say that if you were to drop a frog into a pot of cold water and just heat it gently till it boils, the frog won't even notice, and eventually as the water boils, so would the frog. Put a frog straight into boiling water, however, and it would jump right out. Well, change, like the water, is boiling right now. It's happening constantly, and we need to be aware of it and respond to it appropriately. Change in our lifetime has moved very rapidly indeed, largely thanks to the 5 driving modern forces of change. That's computing, communication, connectivity, collaboration, and convergence. If we take a brief look back in living memory to the time in 1969 when astronauts landed on the moon, it was when the era of computing really came into its own, into the 1970s. In fact, back in July '69, one of the most advanced computer systems in the world was installed by IBM at Mission Control at Cape Canaveral. IBM boasted at the time that the entire system at NASA headquarters had an astonishing 6 megabytes of memory. And the Apollo 11 lander, the Eagle, well, that had just 64 kilobits of computing power on board. Today in your kitchen, a toaster that can tell if your bread is frozen or even needs just to be lightly toasted has got more computing power in it than the Eagle ever did. That's a toaster. If we jump to the 1980s and look back at the cutting-edge communication technology of those days, the first mobile phones were only launched around 1985. They weighed a kilogram. They had a talk time of just 30 minutes, and they needed 10 hours to charge. There were only 5 million of them in the world by the end of the 1980s. And today, well, there's just over 7 billion mobiles in the world. And new ones entering the marketplace? How's this? 5 million a day. That's what gets sold every day, right now. Do you remember the launch of the internet back in the 1990s, when we moved into that era of connectivity? On a state-of-the-art dial-up connection then, which meant, by the way, you couldn't use your phone at the same time, it was amazing. You got the web at speeds of up to 14 kilobits per second. 16 million people were connected to the internet at those speeds by the end of that decade, and they were blown away. It almost seems laughable now, doesn't it, with our 4 megs per second broadband downloads. But I bet you're one of the 3 billion connected people who not only take that for granted, but often moan about how slow it seems to be. The new decade of the 2000s saw the emergence of social media, and the era of collaboration was upon us. Social media was a phenomenon of that time, and although MySpace was first out of the blocks, it was Facebook that came to dominate the platforms. 100 million people were connected to it by 2005. Well, today there's nearly 2 billion of us using social media, and all of us collaborate and Google the planet seemingly constantly and completely. Everything today is now right where you are, across all platforms. Someone senior at Google recently said this: innovation that used to take a generation now just happens in weeks or months. So what's happening in your world, in your business, in your life? Are you feeling the current heat of the temperature? A bit like our famous frog dropped into the pot?